The document hit the table so hard that the ancient wood cracked. Genevieve Winslow did not flinch. She stood with her spine rigid, her dark eyes fixed on the vampire prince across from her, and she pressed her palm flat against the yellowed parchment she had just slammed down between them. Around her, 11 members of the High Vampire Court had gone absolutely still. The kind of stillness that predators achieve when they are deciding whether to strike. The chandeliers above them dripped with 1,000 crystal tears, and the candlelight in this underground hall beneath Vienna made everyone's skin look carved from bone. Everyone's skin except hers. Genevieve was the only living, breathing, warm-blooded human in the room, and every single being surrounding her knew it. "Before you sentence him," she said, and her voice did not shake, "you are going to read this." Lord Casimir, the eldest of the court's ruling 12, rose from his carved chair like smoke rising from an extinguished flame. He was ancient beyond any reasonable measure, white-haired and alabaster-skinned in the way all full-blooded vampires were, and his eyes were the pale silver of ice over deep water. He wore his power the way others wore clothing. "You are in violation of the blood law simply by being present in this chamber, human. The penalty is death, yes, I know." Genevieve didn't look at Casimir. She looked at the vampire chained to the floor in the center of the room, Isidore Gravesend, the rogue prince. They had him in iron restraints threaded with silver wire, the kind that burned vampire flesh and dampened supernatural strength, and even so he looked more like a king than any of the men seated on their velvet thrones around him. He was tall, broader at the shoulder than any man Genevieve had ever stood beside, with hair the color of winter moonlight falling loose around a face that might have been sculpted by someone who had confused beauty with weaponry. His eyes, when they met hers across the ruined silence of the room, were the deep amber of old whiskey, which was unusual for a vampire of his bloodline. Every other Gravesend in recorded history had silver or grey eyes. It was one of the things that had made the court suspicious of him for 300 years. Those amber eyes were telling her to leave. They were screaming it, actually, without a single sound. The muscles in his jaw were tight with something that was not fear, because Genevieve was almost certain that Isidore Gravesend did not feel fear for himself, only a furious, burning, barely leashed terror for other people. For her, specifically, at this moment, she turned back to Casimir and tapped the document. This archive was found in the restricted vaults beneath the Prague Conservatory of Records. I am the head archivist of the Mortal Liaison Division. I had legal access, and what I found there changes everything you think you know about this man's so-called betrayal. Whatever you think you have found, Casimir began. I found his birth record, Genevieve said, the real one. The room went so quiet that she could hear her own heartbeat, fast and stubborn and alive, and everything that had brought her here began to unspool in her memory like thread from a spool dropped on a marble floor. Running back and back to the beginning of a story she hadn't known she was living until she was already at its center. 6 weeks earlier, Genevieve had been doing what she did best, which was cataloging things that other people had forgotten, ignored, or deliberately buried. The Mortal Liaison Division existed because the vampire political structure, which was ancient, sprawling, and labyrinthine in its complexity, had realized sometime in the mid-20th century that human bureaucrats were actually quite useful. Humans aged, humans died. Humans had no political allegiance to vampire bloodlines and no inherited grudges from wars fought in the 14th century. They were, in the careful language of the Accords of 1962, neutral archival instruments. They kept the records. They organized the histories. They were protected by a specific and ironclad blood law that made harming a registered liaison a crime punishable by exile or execution. Genevieve had been the division's head archivist for 4 years, since she was 24, and she was exceptionally good at her job because she had an instinct for what was missing. Any archivist could organize what was present. It took a particular kind of mind to notice the shape of a gap, to feel the outline of something deliberately removed. She had that kind of mind. She also had, if she was honest with herself, a particular and inconvenient stubbornness that tended to send her down rabbit holes that most people, with any sense of self-preservation, would have abandoned. Rabbit hole that had started this particular disaster began with a routine cataloging assignment in the Prague Conservatory. The conservatory was one of 3 major vampire record repositories in Europe, maintained jointly by the court and the liaison division, and it held documents going back over 1,000 years. Genevieve had been sent to cross-reference the bloodline registry with the new digital index they were building, a project that was tedious and meticulous, and exactly the kind of work she loved. She had been 3 days into the assignment when she noticed that the Gravesend family records had a gap, not a small gap, not a misplaced folder or a water-damaged page. An entire decade of birth records for the Gravesend bloodline, covering the years 1689 through 1699, had been systematically and deliberately removed from the main archive. She could see where they had been. The binding holes were still in the original ledger. The chemical composition of the ink left residual traces on the neighboring pages that her ultraviolet scanner picked up. Someone had extracted those pages, and they had done it long ago enough that the removal had calcified into assumed normalcy. She would not have thought much of it, would have simply logged the gap and moved on, except that in the restricted vault below the main archive floor, behind a door that her liaison clearance technically permitted her to enter, she found a secondary ledger that had been misfiled under an entirely different bloodline's records. It was the removed pages. All of them. And one particular birth record, dated the 14th of November 1693, changed everything. The name listed was not Isidore. The parents listed were not who the official court record claimed. The notes in the margins, written in an old chancellor's hand that she had already encountered dozens of times in the legitimate records and could identify by sight, described the circumstances of the birth in language that was careful and coded, but unmistakable once you understood what you were reading. Genevieve sat in the vault for 4 hours. Then she photographed every page, packed the originals with the careful reverence she gave to all fragile documents, and went back to her temporary office in the conservatory's upper floor to think. The problem was the following. The document she had found, if it meant what she believed it meant, completely dismantled the legal basis for the charges of bloodline betrayal that the High Court had filed against Isidore Gravesend approximately 18 months ago. He had been living in what the court called exile, which in practice meant that he moved through European cities with a handful of loyal people and no fixed territory, and there was an open warrant for his formal trial. Everyone in the vampire world and everyone in the liaison division who paid attention to vampire politics, which was everyone who wanted to keep their jobs, knew the story. Isidore Gravesend, third-born son of the Gravesend bloodline, had allegedly restricted bloodline intelligence with a rival house during a territorial dispute. Under the blood laws, sharing ancestral secrets with an enemy was classified as betrayal, and the penalty for a prince of a sovereign bloodline was very specifically outlined. It was not merciful. What everyone also knew, spoken in whispers and never in official channels, was that Isidore had been a problem for the court long before the betrayal charge. He operated outside their political games. He had publicly objected to the court's treatment of lower-ranked vampire families on multiple occasions. He had, according to rumors that Genevieve had heard from colleagues in the liaison division who dealt directly with court affairs, personally intervened twice to prevent violence against human liaisons when powerful vampires had decided the blood law was inconvenient. In other words, the man who the court called the rogue prince was, by Genevieve's reading of the situation, dangerous to exactly the people who deserved to be in danger. But that was not her job. Her job was the documents. She had been telling herself that, firmly and sensibly, for exactly 2 days when someone broke into her room at the conservatory's residential quarters at 3 in the morning. She was awake. She was always awake at 3 in the morning. Sleep had been a complicated negotiation for her since graduate school. She was sitting at her desk reviewing her photographs of the vault documents when the window, which was on the 4th floor and had no external ledge, opened inward. She had her hand on the small canister of colloidal silver spray that all liaison archivists carried before the window was fully open, and she was on her feet with her chair between herself and the window before the figure climbing through it was fully inside the room. He was much larger than her. He was, in fact, the most physically imposing person she had ever been in a room with, and she had attended vampire court functions before. He wore dark clothing, nothing aristocratic about it, and his white hair was tied back from his face. His eyes, catching the lamplight of her desk, were that unmistakable amber. She knew who he was immediately. She had seen photographs, of course. The liaison division kept photographs of all the significant figures in vampire politics, and Isidore Gravesend was as significant as they came. She did not lower the canister. He looked at it, then at her, and something moved in his expression that might, on a less controlled face, have been surprise. "I was told you were the archivist who found the Prague records," he said. His voice was low and precise, the kind of voice that had spent centuries learning exactly how much force to use. "And I was told you were in Frankfurt," she said, "which means we are both operating with imperfect information." The silence stretched between them. He was still half in the window, which struck her as a significant tactical position. She was between him and the door. She did not move. "I am not here to harm you," he said. "The blood law protects me anyway," she said. "So that's almost irrelevant." Another flicker in his expression. "You are not afraid of me. I'm cautious of you. Those are different things." She kept her eyes on his. "If you wanted the documents, you would have taken them instead of climbing through my window. So you want something else. Sit down if you like." The chair by the window looked structurally adequate. He climbed the rest of the way through the window with a fluid grace that was genuinely remarkable, and he sat in the chair she had indicated with the kind of posture that made chairs look like thrones. His eyes never left her. "What did you find?" he asked. "What do you think I found?" "Something in the restricted vault, something about my bloodline's records for the 1690s. His jaw tightened. "Something that someone has been keeping buried for over 300 years. Genevieve set the silver canister down on the desk. She kept it within reach, but she set it down. "Your birth record," she said. "The real one." The amber eyes went very still. "Tell me what it says." "It says," she said carefully, watching every micro-expression on his face, "that the circumstances of your birth were significantly different from the official Gravesend bloodline record. It says that the then Chancellor of the Court was aware of this and chose to document it separately and suppress the information. And it says," she paused, "that the bloodline betrayal charge currently hanging over you is founded on a legal classification that does not apply to you. Because the thing the charge is based on assumes a bloodline relationship that the real record contradicts." Isidore Gravesend sat very still for a long moment. Then quietly he said, "You understand what that means?" "I understand exactly what it means," she said. "It means someone in the court knew this record existed and chose to bring the betrayal charge anyway, which means the charge was never about bloodline law. It was about removing you, yes, because you kept objecting to things they wanted to do. Among other reasons." His voice was even. "There are factions within the court that have been working to consolidate power for decades in ways that are technically within the blood laws but ethically bankrupt. I was becoming inconvenient. So they found a charge they could make stick because the real record had been buried long enough that no one alive remembered it." She looked at him steadily. "Who buried it the first time?" "My grandfather," he said. "Presumably because the truth of my origins was more complicated than the official story, and the official story served his political purposes." "Your grandfather," she said carefully, "listed your parents as Edric and Mara Gravesend on the official record. The real record gives different names, different parent names. Yes, you knew about this?" "I suspected," he said. "I had no proof. The gap in the records was not something I discovered. I was told by someone who died before they could explain further that the official record of my birth was a construction." He looked at her with those amber eyes that were so different from every other Gravesend she had ever catalogued, and for the first time she saw something underneath the composure. A careful, controlled exhaustion. "I have been looking for proof for 140 years. Genevieve was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You have been living under a sentence built on a lie for 18 months. You could have run. You have the resources and the connections to disappear entirely." "Yes. Why didn't you?" The amber eyes held hers. "Because running would have meant the lie won. And because the people the court is currently maneuvering against." The The smaller bloodlines, the human liaisons who work in territories where certain court members have decided the protections are advisory rather than mandatory. They need someone with enough standing to object. He paused. Running would have abandoned them. She looked at him for a long time. "You have been staying within reach of a court that wants to execute you," she said slowly, "in order to remain useful to people who don't even know you're protecting them." "I would not phrase it quite so grandly." "I would," she said. "I'm an archivist. Accuracy is my professional obligation." Something crossed his face that was so unexpected she almost didn't catalogue it correctly. It looked like the beginning of a smile. "Miss Winslow," he said. I know. You're going to tell me the document is dangerous. You're going to tell me that the people who buried it will come for me if I make it public. You're going to tell me that I should log a note, officially report the gap, and go home to London and let the court's internal processes handle it." "No," he said. "I was going to ask if you would help me." She blinked. It was, she realized, the first time in this conversation that she had been genuinely surprised. "Help you what, exactly?" "Bring it before the court," he said. "Formally, legally, in a way they cannot dismiss or suppress. You are a registered human liaison with lawful access to restricted conservatory documents. Your findings have protected status under the Accords. If you present the document in an official court session, they cannot simply make it disappear. They would have to respond to it. Legally, and in the meantime," she said, "the people who buried the original document 300 years ago, or their political inheritors, will try to stop us from reaching that session." "Yes," he said. "Almost certainly." She looked at the stack of photographed documents on her desk. She looked at her silver canister. She looked at the man sitting in her window chair, watching her with amber eyes that were doing an exceptionally poor job of hiding how much this mattered to him. "All right," she said, "but I have conditions." He said nothing. He simply waited, which she found she appreciated. "You will not make any decision affecting my safety or my movements without consulting me first. I am not a ward, I am a colleague. If we are working together, we are working together, not you managing me at a careful distance." She held up a second finger. "You will be honest with me. About the dangers, about the political complications, about anything relevant. I cannot make good decisions with incomplete information, and I will not be handled." "And the third condition?" he asked, and she realized she had raised a third finger. "Stop looking at me like I'm going to shatter," she said. "I'm a human archivist who has been navigating vampire court politics for 4 years. I know what I signed up for." The smile that had been threatening at the edges of his expression arrived fully, and it was, she catalogued involuntarily, quite devastating. "You have conditions," he said, "for helping a vampire prince who is currently a fugitive, who broke into your room at 3 in the morning, and who is asking you to walk into a court that will view your presence as a violation of their sovereign jurisdiction." "I do," she agreed. "Very well," Isidore Gravesend said. "I accept all 3. The next 3 weeks were the most dangerous and the most alive that Genevieve had ever felt, and she was not entirely sure what to do with that information. They moved carefully. Isidore had a small network of people he trusted. 2 vampires who had been with him for over a century, and a human legal analyst named Petra, who worked for the Liaison Division's Brussels office and had been collecting her own evidence about the court's ethical violations for the better part of 2 years. Together, the 5 of them worked across 3 cities, cross-referencing the Prague documents against other archived records that Genevieve's credentials could access, building a picture that was not just about Isidore's birth record, but about the pattern of manipulation that had kept certain documents buried while others were strategically promoted. She worked long hours, which was normal for her. What was not normal was working long hours with someone sitting across the table from her, reading through his own suppressed history with an expression of controlled, precise attention, while occasionally asking her questions that demonstrated a legal understanding of vampire archival records that was frankly better than most of the trained archivists she had worked with. "How do you know the registry notation system this well?" she asked him one evening, in a rented safe house in Munich that smelled of old wood and the particular ozone and cedar scent she was starting to associate with Isidore himself. He looked up from the document he was reading. "I taught myself," he said. "When I first suspected that my records had been altered, I spent approximately 40 years learning everything there was to know about how vampire archival systems work, how documents are dated, how forgeries are identified, how legitimately removed and refiled records leave different chemical signatures than deliberately suppressed ones. 40 years, she said. I had time. She looked at him. He was lit by lamplight, which softened the angularity of his face without diminishing the precision of it, and he had rolled the sleeves of his dark shirt back to his elbows, which was the most casual she had ever seen him. He looked like someone who had been carved for a specific purpose, and was now sitting quietly in a kitchen, reading archival documents, which was such a strange combination that she found herself watching him when he wasn't looking at her, and then rapidly looking away when he was. What was it like? She asked, knowing there was something wrong with the official story but not being able to prove it. He was quiet for a moment. Like reading a book with pages missing, he said finally. You can follow the plot, more or less. But there are moments where the narrative does not quite cohere, where characters behave in ways that the established logic of the story does not fully explain, and you keep going back to the missing pages because you know that is where the actual explanation lives. Genevieve thought about her own instinct for gaps, the shape of absences. Yes, she said. I know that feeling. His eyes met hers, and held there a moment longer than necessary, and she was very busy cataloguing the pattern of the wood grain on the table when Petra came in with coffee and a stack of newly printed cross-references, and the moment dissolved into work. But it stayed with her. These small moments accumulated like pages in a ledger, and she was organized enough to know that ledgers added up to something. The danger arrived on the 23rd day in Zurich. They had been meeting with a retired court chancellor, an elderly vampire named Ruthven, who had served during the period when the original records had been removed, and who had agreed, reluctantly and with evident fear, to provide a written statement about what he had witnessed. He had confirmed what Genevieve had suspected from the documents. The suppression of Isidore's true birth record had been ordered by the senior Gravesend patriarch, aided by a court member who was still active, who had seen political advantage in keeping Isidore's actual origins obscure. Ruthven had barely finished signing the statement when the building's fire alarm went off, and Isidore was on his feet before the sound had fully registered in Genevieve's ears. That is not a fire alarm, he said. What is it? She asked, already reaching for her bag. It is a distress signal. The specific frequency is used by court enforcement teams when they are moving to contain a location. He was already at the window, looking out at the street below, with an assessment that lasted less than 2 seconds. They found us. There are 4 of them at the main entrance. 2 more covering the east exit. The roof, Petra asked. Covered Genevieve. He turned to her, and his voice was completely level, but his eyes were doing something she had not seen them do before. They were urgent in a way that was almost physical. I need you to stay very close to me. I know you have conditions about not being managed, and I respect them, and I am telling you now as a colleague. The Accords protect you legally, but court enforcement in the field does not always observe the Accords perfectly, and the people who have sent this team know that document exists and know you have it. They want to take me in, she said. They want to take the document. What happens to you in the process is variable. His jaw was tight. Stay, with me? All right, she said. But I want to note for the record that this is not me being managed. This is me making an informed tactical decision. Noted, he said. Move. What followed was the most concentrated 40 minutes of her life. Isidore moved through the building with the certainty of someone who had been planning exits since the moment they entered, which she suspected was exactly what he had been doing. He knew where the utility corridors were, where the building's service elevator connected to a subterranean parking structure that shared a wall with the adjacent building, and he had an almost supernatural awareness, which she supposed was literally true, of where the enforcement team was at any given moment. He also kept himself physically between her and any direction from which trouble might come, in a way that was so consistent and so obviously deliberate that she would have found it irritating if it had not also been, she admitted to herself, genuinely reassuring. They reached the underground parking structure. 2 of the enforcement team were there waiting. She did not seize exactly what Isidore did in the next 30 seconds, because it was too fast for human eyes to fully track. But when it was over, both court enforcers were restrained against a concrete pillar with their own equipment, unharmed but extremely immobilized. And Isidore was standing between her and them with his white hair loose from its tie and an expression of calm that was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. "You did not hurt them," she said as they moved toward the far exit. "They are court enforcers following orders. The fault is not theirs." He held the door for her with a formality that was almost absurd, given the circumstances. "The fault belongs to the person who gave the orders." They reached the street. Petra and Ruthven were 3 steps behind them. The night was cold, and the Zurich streets were rain-slicked and ordinary, and Genevieve felt the adrenaline in her hands like a fine tremor. Isidore noticed. He was walking beside her, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and he looked down at her hands and then at her face. "You are shaking," he said, "residual adrenaline." "I am fine." "I know you are fine," he said. "You can be fine and also shaking." She looked up at him. "Are you ever afraid?" she asked. "In situations like that?" He was quiet for a moment. "I am afraid," he said, "of losing people I am responsible for. The physical danger to myself is a secondary concern." She thought about the 2 enforcers he had disarmed without harming, the routing he had planned before the emergency arose, the way he had moved through 40 minutes of crisis with the focus of someone whose primary calculation was always someone else's safety. "You are very inconveniently good at protecting people," she said. He glanced at her sideways, and there it was again, the beginning of that smile. "You say inconveniently, as though it is a problem. It makes it difficult to maintain a professional cataloguing distance," she said. He was quiet for several steps. Then, "Miss Winslow." "Genevieve," she said. "We have now been chased through a building together. I think we are past surnames." "Genevieve," he said, and something in the way he said it, precise and careful, and like he was placing something fragile on a shelf where it would be safe, made her look straight ahead at the rainy Zurich street and say nothing for a block and a half. The Zurich near-miss accelerated their timeline. The court was now actively hunting them, which meant they could not afford to spend weeks gathering further corroborating evidence. They had the primary document, Ruthven's signed statement, and Genevieve's professional findings as head archivist, and that was, she concluded after 2 hours of precise analytical review, enough. "It has to be enough," she said, "because now they know what we have. Every additional day gives them time to build a counter-argument, or to intercept the documents. Or to intercept you," Isidore said. "Or that, yes, which means we go to Vienna." She looked at him across the table. "We request an emergency session of the High Court under the Accord's Article 7, which grants any registered liaison the right to present archival findings in a formal judicial proceeding. They cannot legally refuse the session. And then we walk in and we put the documents on the table." The 2 users who served as Isidore's loyal companions, Thessaly, a silver-eyed woman who had been with him since the 1800s, and Vale, older and quieter with eyes the color of a January sky, exchanged a look. "You would be walking into a room full of people who want to suppress what you've found," Thessaly said to Genevieve. "And the blood law, while real, has been violated before in closed sessions." "I am aware," Genevieve said. "But the Accord's protection is also on record with the human diplomatic channels. If I go missing after requesting a formal session, that triggers an international inquiry, which is an outcome the court cannot afford right now." She looked at Isidore. "They will not touch me in an open session. The risk is too high." Isidore was watching her with an expression she had come to recognize over the past weeks, not the careful composure he wore for everyone else, but the particular attention he gave her that was something layered and precise and warm in a way that Amber always was. "You have thought through every angle," he said. "That is my job," she said. "Genevieve." His voice dropped a register, and she went very still. "I need to say something that is not about the legal strategy." She waited. "If we walk into that room and it goes wrong," he said, "I need you to know that I will not let them harm you, regardless of the political cost to me or to the case. You are." He stopped, seemed to consider the word he had been about to use, and chose a different one with visible deliberateness. "Essential, not to the case, to me." The room had gone very quiet. Petra was suddenly very interested in the window. Thessaly and Vale had both found reason to look elsewhere. Genevieve looked at Isidore. "You told me," she said, "when you climbed through my window in Prague, that you had been looking for the truth of your birth for 140 years. Yes, and you have spent the last 3 weeks working alongside me every day with the patience and the consideration and the absolute lack of condescension that I have been hoping to find in a professional colleague for my entire career, and also you carried me out of a burning situation without once suggesting that I could not handle myself." "You are very capable of handling yourself," he said. "I know I am. The point is that you knew it too." She looked at him steadily. "You are essential to me as well, Isidore. Not just the case." The silence between them was the specific silence of something irreversible being acknowledged. Then Vale said, from the window, "If the two of you have finished, we have a court session to prepare for." They entered Vienna the following evening, through the old passages beneath the city that the vampire world had been using since the Habsburg era, and they were in the subterranean hall of the High Court by 9 o'clock. Genevieve had sent the formal request for emergency session through the Accord's channel 48 hours earlier. The court could not refuse it. They had tried, through 3 different bureaucratic mechanisms, and Petra's legal counterarguments had dismantled each one with a thoroughness that Genevieve found professionally satisfying. The hall was everything she had expected, and more than she had hoped. It was underground, which all the major vampire courts were, lit by genuine fire in iron sconces along walls that held the carved seals of 12 bloodlines. The court's ruling members sat elevated on a curved dais, 11 of them present, and Isidore was brought in separately, already restrained, before she entered. She had insisted on entering after him. She had wanted to see the room before she performed in it, and she had wanted to see what state they brought him in. When she saw the silver wire restraints, something that she had been keeping professionally organized in the back of her emotional register shifted into a harder register. Not grief, not fear. Something closer to the feeling she got when she found a document that had been deliberately destroyed, a precise and principled anger. She walked to the table. She placed the documents on it. She looked at Casimir, who was rising from his chair with the weight of several centuries behind him, and she pressed her hand flat against the parchment. "Before you sentence him," she said, "you are going to read this." Casimir looked at the document she was indicating. He looked at her with the silver eyes that had probably seen empires fall. "I am a registered head archivist of the Mortal Liaison Division, invoking Article 7 of the Accords, which grants me the right to present archival findings in any formal judicial proceeding regardless of location. My request for this session was logged, acknowledged, and legally accepted. Everything I am doing in this room is covered." She slid the document toward him. "Read it." He did not reach for it. He looked instead at the man chained to the floor. "The rogue prince's legal status changes completely based on what is in that document," she said, "which is why I am asking you to read it before you say anything further that you will need to officially retract." Another court member, a vampire named Severine, dark-eyed and sharp-faced, leaned forward. "What is this document?" "It is the original birth record of the man you are calling Isidore Gravesend, third-born son of the Gravesend bloodline, whose alleged bloodline membership is the entire foundation of the betrayal charge." Genevieve kept her voice level and precise. "The record you have in your official registry is a fabrication created by the Gravesend patriarch in 1693 and maintained by a court member who is currently sitting in this room." The silence was tremendous. "The real record," she continued, "shows that Isidore was not born of the Gravesend blood at all. He was the child of a bloodline that the Gravesend patriarch wanted access to, obtained through an agreement that the patriarch then suppressed to maintain control of the heir. Isidore was registered as Gravesend, given a Gravesend name, raised in the Gravesend household, and never told the truth of his origins." She let that sit. "Under blood law," she said, "a person who does not share the blood of a claimed bloodline cannot legally hold bloodline secrets, because the secrets were never technically theirs to keep or betray. The charge of bloodline betrayal requires a legitimate blood connection. Isidore Gravesend has no blood connection to the Gravesend line. He never did, which means the charge cannot stand." Casimir's voice, when it came, was very quiet. You have documentation supporting this. Original documents from the Prague Conservatory Restricted Vault, a signed statement from Chancellor Ruthven, who witnessed the original suppression, and my own forensic analysis as head archivist confirming the document's authenticity and the deliberate nature of the original record's removal. She straightened. And I have a secondary set of certified copies held by the Human Diplomatic Service in Brussels. So I would ask that no one in this room consider the possibility of simply making the documents I am holding disappear. The copies will be released automatically if I do not check in with my office within the next 4 hours. She had learned from Isidore to plan exits before emergencies arose. The murmur that moved through the court was the sound of 11 very old, very powerful beings recalibrating, Séphirine said, with a precision that told Genevieve she was the most dangerous person in the room. Who in this court was involved in the original suppression? Genevieve picked up the secondary document from the stack. She had been hoping someone would ask. The notation in the margin of the original suppressed record refers to the court's representative by a role title, not by name. However, the handwriting in that notation matches the handwriting in 17 other court documents from the same period, all of which are signed. She placed the comparative analysis she and Petra had spent 4 days building on the table. The handwriting belongs to the court member who held the position of bloodline registrar from 1680 to 1710. She looked up at Casimir, who was also the court member who filed the current betrayal charge against Isidore. The name that moved around the room was not Casimir's name. It was the name of the court member seated 3 chairs to his left, a vampire called Heilig, who had been very still since Genevieve began speaking. Heilig, who had silver-grey eyes and white hair coiled in an elaborate, upswept style, and who, Genevieve had noted from the moment she entered the room, had been watching her with the particular attention of someone who had not expected her to be quite this prepared. Heilig rose. "These are forgeries," she said. Her voice was completely smooth. "Created by a rogue archivist working in collaboration with a fugitive who has every reason to manufacture exculpatory evidence." "That is a logical argument," Genevieve said pleasantly, "which is why I anticipated it." She produced the chemical analysis report. Forensic dating of the ink and parchment of the documents I found places their creation squarely in the 1690s. The specific iron gall compound used in the ink was discontinued in the early 18th century. The parchment composition is consistent with materials used in the conservatory's bookbinding operations in that period, and inconsistent with any material available in the last 50 years. These documents are not modern forgeries. They are old, older than Isidore's current situation, older than the betrayal charge. They predate any motive he might have to manufacture them. Heilig's composure did not crack, but it changed at the edges, the way old plaster changes before the underlying structure gives way. Casimir, who had been reading the birth record in silence for the last 3 minutes, looked up. His ancient silver eyes moved from the document to Isidore, then to Heilig, then to Genevieve. Something shifted in the architecture of his expression. "Lord Heilig," Casimir said very quietly, "I think you should sit down." The sound of those 6 words hitting the room was like a door closing on something that had been open for 300 years. Heilig sat. Casimir set the document down on the broad arm of his chair. He looked at the court around him. "The session will recess for 7 days to allow full forensic review of the documents presented under Article 7. He looked at Genevieve. "The archivist's professional findings and the associated materials are entered into the court's formal record. The bloodline betrayal charge against Isidore Gravesend is suspended pending review." "Suspended," Genevieve said. "It is the procedure," Casimir said. "I understand procedure," she held his gaze. "I also know that a suspended charge leaves him in legal limbo. The Accord's Article 11 provides for provisional release of any detained individual during a procedural review, provided a registered liaison posts a formal surety. I am posting that surety now, on behalf of the Mortal Liaison Division." The silence was different this quieter, more complete. Casimir looked at her for a very long moment, then he looked at the court. "Release his restraints," he said. "Lord Gravesend is provisionally released pending the 7-day review." Thessaly, who had been standing at the back of the room, appeared at Isidore's side before the words had finished echoing. She had the restraints off in seconds, and Isidore rose to his full height with a slow, controlled deliberateness that filled the room with something that was not exactly a threat and was not exactly safe, somewhere in between. His eyes found Genevieve across the room. She looked back at him, and she felt the full weight of the last 6 weeks settle into the present moment like the final page of a very long document landing in its correct place. The 7-day review was, in the end, 11 days. Genevieve spent most of it in official sessions, answering questions, presenting supplementary analyses, walking the court's technical review committee through every element of her findings, with the same precision she would have brought to any archival assignment. Petra was there for the legal arguments. Ruthven's statement stood up to every challenge they threw at it. Halig's position on the court was suspended on the 4th day, pending a separate investigation into the original suppression and into the filing of the fraudulent betrayal charge. The specific court members who had supported the charge, knowing or unknowing of its fraudulent basis, were formally notified of the investigation. The court's internal mechanisms, slow and ancient as they were, had begun to move. Isidore and Genevieve were given separate temporary quarters in the court's above-ground residential wing, which was in a building that presented itself to the outside world as a private hotel in Vienna's 1st district, all high ceilings and gilded details and very good coffee. On the 6th evening, he knocked on her door. She opened it and found him in the hallway, still in his day clothes, which by this point she associated entirely with him and not with vampire fashion generally. He had a document in his hand. "Something I want to show you," he said. "If you have a moment." "I have several moments." "Come in." He sat in the chair beside her window, the one with the view of the street, and she sat opposite him with the lamp on the table between them, and he placed the document flat on her desk with care. It was a letter, very old, in the same careful ink as the records she had spent 6 weeks analyzing. But the handwriting was different, smaller, more cramped, more hurried. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "My coat, effectively." He watched her face. "I have been carrying it for 140 years. The person who told me the official record was a fabrication gave it to me on the night they died. I have never been able to fully decipher it, because it is written in a cipher I only partially understood." She looked at the document. She looked at him. "You want me to read it? You understand the notation systems of that period better than anyone I have ever met," he said. "And I." He paused, and the pause was very precisely the length of someone deciding to stop maintaining a particular kind of distance. "I trust you." The weight of that phrase from Isidore Gravesend, a man who had survived 300 years of court politics by being very careful about who he trusted, settled over her like something both heavy and warm. She turned the letter toward the lamp. She read it slowly, working through the cipher, which was a variation on a system she had encountered in several other court documents from the same era, and which she had studied thoroughly enough to move through it with growing confidence. The letter was from a woman. The signature at the bottom was not a name but a symbol, a stylized mark she had seen in one other place, the secondary ledger from the Prague vault, in the margin next to the notation about Isidore's birth, his birth mother's mark. She read the letter 3 times. Then she set it down carefully. "She loved you," Genevieve said. "The letter is. It is a letter to a child she knew she would not see grow up." She explains why she agreed to the arrangement with the Gravesend patriarch. She was protecting her bloodline. Her family was in serious debt to the Gravesends, and the only way to clear it was to give them an heir, which she did. And in exchange, her family's bloodline was protected and their territory was secured. She looked at Isidore. "She says she hoped the life she was giving you would be better than the one she could have provided. She says she hoped you would be brave." Something moved through his face that he did not try to control or contain, and it was the most purely human expression she had ever seen on him, and it made her chest ache with a tenderness so sudden and complete that she had to look at the letter for a moment to compose herself. "She hoped you would be brave," she said again quietly. "I think you fulfilled that." He was quiet for a long time. The Vienna street sounds floated up faintly through the window, ordinary city sounds, cars and voices, and the specific ambience of a city that had been layered over its own history for centuries.
"I spent so long,"
he said, "wanting to know who I was, what the real story was." feeling that the official account was a lie, and that somewhere under the lie there was an explanation that would make sense of things that didn't quite cohere. He looked at the letter. I did not expect her to have been someone who loved me. Most people who are deliberately absent, Genevieve said carefully, are absent for reasons that feel very large to them at the time. That does not always make the love smaller. He looked at her. You speak from experience. She smiled, a small sideways thing. My mother was a researcher. She was absent for large portions of my childhood because her work took her away. I spent a long time being angry about it, and then a longer time understanding it, and eventually I reached a place where I could hold both things at once. She folded her hands on the table. The anger and the love. They are not mutually exclusive. No, he said. I suppose they are not. They were quiet together for a while, which was something she had noticed they were very good at. The comfortable silences had appeared somewhere around the second week of working together, when the need to fill every pause with professional communication had eased, and what remained was simply the ease of being in a room with someone whose presence you found genuinely restful. Genevieve, he said. Yes. When the review concludes, he said, and the charge is formally dismissed, and the court's investigation into Heilig's conduct is underway, and the political situation has stabilized, he stopped, and the deliberate precision of the sentence he was building was very evident. I would like to ask you something. She looked at him. You could ask me now. I could, he agreed, but I want to ask when there is no immediate danger, complicating the context, when it is simply a question and not a crisis. She considered this. That is either very romantic or extremely aggravating, she said. Possibly both, he said, and the smile arrived completely this time, without hesitation. On the 11th day, the High Court of the vampire world reconvened in the subterranean hall. Genevieve stood to one side of the room this time, with Petra and Thessaly and Vael. Isidore stood before the court alone, which he had requested. She had respected the request. Casimir read the court's findings in the measured, resonant voice of someone who had been reading formal decisions for longer than most nations had existed. The forensic evidence was confirmed authentic. The handwriting analysis was confirmed conclusive. The historical record of Heilig's involvement in both the original suppression and the current fraudulent charge was confirmed by additional documentary evidence that the court's own investigators had uncovered once they knew what to look for. The charge of bloodline betrayal was formally and permanently dismissed. Heilig was remanded to a formal tribunal. The Gravesend bloodline was notified of the findings, a situation that Genevieve privately suspected was going to generate a significant amount of vampire political chaos over the next several decades, but that was a problem for the future. And Isidore stood in the hall, free, with the legal fiction that had shaped his entire existence finally dismantled, and the expression on his face was the most complicated and most honest thing she had seen in 11 days, which was saying something. After the formal session ended and the court members had withdrawn to their deliberations, and Petra was already on the telephone with Brussels, and Thessaly and Vael were doing the specific kind of subdued, quiet celebration that people who have been running and protecting for a long time do when they can finally exhale, Isidore walked across the room to where Genevieve was standing. You said you would ask me something when the danger was over, she said. I did, he agreed. I think this qualifies. He stood before her, and he was tall and white-haired and amber-eyed, and entirely himself. No longer stressed by the pretense of a bloodline that had never been his, no longer running, no longer carrying the weight of a charge built on 3 centuries of lies, and he looked at her with the particular attention that was only ever hers. I would like, he said, to spend time with you that is not organized around a crisis. I would like to take you to dinner in a city where no one is chasing us. I would like to continue the conversation we have been having, in quiet rooms and across archival tables, for the rest of whatever version of time we find ourselves sharing. He paused. I am aware that I am a vampire prince whose actual bloodline origin is now the subject of court investigation, whose idea of a good evening has historically involved reading 300-year-old legal documents, and who broke into your room at 3 a.m. the first time we met. I recognize these are not the most conventional qualifications. You have excellent taste in chairs, she said. He blinked. You picked the best chair in my room in Prague, she said. That is a meaningful data point about character Genevieve. The answer is yes, she said. To all of it, the dinner, the conversations, the time, yes. The smile that crossed his face was different from the ones she had catalogued before. It was fuller, less guarded, lit from somewhere inside it. She filed it carefully in a part of her memory that she was allocating specifically for this purpose. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and his touch was cool in the way she had always known it would be, and steady in the way she had learned to expect from everything he did. I have a question of my own, she said. Of course. Your actual bloodline, the one in the real record. Do you know anything about them? He was quiet for a moment. The name in the record is Valen. It is an old bloodline, very old, older than the Gravesends by several centuries. They still exist. They are not a court bloodline. They keep to the Northern Territories and stay out of politics, which is, he paused, probably where certain tendencies of mine originate. You are going to contact them. Eventually, he said. I am not in a hurry. I have been without that knowledge for 300 years. A few more months will not change anything fundamental. He looked at her. Besides, I find I am more interested at the moment in the immediate future than in the past. She looked at their joined hands. That is possibly the first time I have ever heard you prioritize the future over historical documentation. You are a remarkably transformative influence, he said. I am an archivist, she said. Transformation is not technically in my job description. And yet, he said, Vienna in early spring was the kind of city that made you understand why certain places accumulate centuries of stories. The streets above the court's underground world were full of music and coffee, and the particular golden light of late afternoon, and Genevieve walked through them with Isidore beside her, and found that the world felt both entirely the same and entirely different, which she thought was probably the correct way for things to feel, after your understanding of something had been fundamentally revised. They had dinner in a small restaurant in the 3rd District that had been there since 1887. Which Isidore mentioned in passing, because he had been there in 1887, and which served food that was exceptional, and he sat across from her, with a glass of wine he barely touched, and she ate most of the bread basket, and they talked for 3.5 hours. They talked about the Valen bloodline, and what she knew about their history from the archival records, which was more than he did, which delighted her. They talked about the court's likely trajectory after Heilig's tribunal, which was complex enough to keep them both engaged for a full hour. They talked about what Genevieve's job would look like once the Article 7 case was formally concluded, and whether she wanted to stay in the Mortal Liaison Division or do something else. What would you do, she asked, if you could do anything? He considered this with the deliberateness he gave to all meaningful questions. I have spent 3 centuries trying to influence vampire politics from the inside of a system that was partly built on lies about who I was. I think, he looked at the middle distance for a moment, I would like to do something quieter. Something that is more directly useful to people who need it. He looked at her, the smaller bloodlines I mentioned, the human liaisons in territories where the accords are observed loosely. There is work to be done that does not require court politics. It requires someone who understands the law well enough to argue it, and who has no particular political agenda. An advocate, she said. Of a sort I could help with that, she said. The documentary side of it, the archival evidence, the historical legal precedents. That is very much my professional area. He looked at her with those amber eyes. You would consider that kind of work? I already do that kind of work, she said. I just did it for the most high-profile case in recent vampire legal history, while being chased through 4 countries. A quieter version sounds almost restful. He laughed, which was something she had only heard him do once before, in the safe house in Munich, when Petra had made an extremely dry observation about vampire bureaucracy. It was a good sound, genuine and warm and entirely at odds with the image the vampire world had constructed of the rogue prince. She thought, I want to hear that sound regularly. I will organize the rest of my life in whatever direction makes that most likely. She thought, I am very thoroughly in love with this person, and I have been since approximately the 2nd week, and I was correct to not mention it until the crisis was over, because I would not have wanted him to think it was a circumstantial emotion. She looked at him across the table, lit by the warm light of a restaurant that was older than most living people. And she said nothing for a moment because she was busy being very happy in a particular quiet way that did not require immediate articulation. He seemed to understand. That was one of the things about him. He was exceptionally good at understanding what she was not saying. "Genevieve," he said. "Yes, I have not told you something that I should tell you." She set down her fork. "When I came through your window in Prague," he said, "I was looking for the archivist who had found the documents. I had been told your professional credentials, your analytical reputation, the fact that you were the best archivist the liaison division had in Europe. I was prepared for someone effective." He paused. "I was not prepared for you specifically. I was not prepared for the way you looked at me and were not afraid, and told me your conditions, and said that we were past surnames before the end of the first hour." His voice was very level. "I have lived for over 3 centuries. I have met a great many people. I have never met anyone who made me feel, within the span of a single conversation, that I had been waiting for a particular kind of understanding that I had not known I was waiting for." Genevieve was quiet. "I am telling you this," he said, "because you told me in the middle of a crisis that I was essential to you, and you said it with the same directness and precision that you bring to everything, and I want to be equally direct." He looked at her across the table. "You are the most important person in my world. You were, I think, approximately 6 days in, though I resisted categorizing it that way for a while longer. I think it was the Munich safe house for me," she said. "You were reading your own suppressed history with the most focused attention I have ever seen, and you took a break to ask me if I had eaten, because I had not. And you were right, and you had somehow organized dinner in a safe house. While being hunted, you had been working for 9 hours. You had been reading documentation about your own falsified identity. That did not mean you should miss dinner." She looked at him, and she felt the full accumulated weight of 6 weeks. The adrenaline and the archive rooms, the running and the silence, the conversations that had stretched into the early hours, the specific patience he had brought to every moment of difficulty, the way he had looked at her from iron restraints in the court's hall, with amber eyes that were afraid for her and not for himself. "Come with me," she said. He looked at her. "I want to walk," she said. "Vienna in the evening, no crisis, no documents, no court." She held out her hand across the table. He took it. The city was quiet and cold and beautiful, and they walked along the ring road, where the old buildings were lit against a dark sky, and she was warm in her coat, and he was exactly as cool as she knew he would be. And they held hands with no political agenda, and no danger, and no immediate crisis requiring management. "I need to go back to London at some point," she said. "The division office, the apartment, my very neglected houseplant." "How long has the houseplant been neglected?" "Approximately 6 weeks. Is it likely to have survived?" "It is a succulent. It has survived everything else I have subjected it to. I have a reasonable confidence." She looked at him sideways. "Vienna is a good city." "It is," he agreed. "I could stay here longer if there was a reason to." He was quiet for a moment. "I will be in Vienna for some time while the tribunal proceedings continue. The Valen bloodline has a representative who has requested a meeting. There is," he paused, "a great deal of my own history that I am only just beginning to understand, and it seems most of the relevant documentation is in Europe." "Well," she said, "it happens that I specialize in European vampire archival documentation." "It does happen that way," he said, and the warmth in his voice was the most domestic and wonderful thing she had ever heard from a being who had been alive for 300 years. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her, and she turned to face him. And he was looking at her with those amber eyes that she had now spent 6 weeks learning to read, and she stepped forward and kissed him. He was very still for exactly 1 second. The stillness of someone who has been holding something very carefully and has just been given permission to set it down safely. And then his hand came up to her face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the impression he gave the rest of the world. And he kissed her back in the way that she had suspected he would do everything, which was with absolute attention and complete honesty. Vienna moved around them, indifferent and ancient, full of its own centuries of accumulated stories, And Genevieve Winslow kissed the vampire, who was no longer technically a prince, but who would always carry the architecture of royalty in his posture, and thought, "This is the beginning of a very good chapter." The months that followed arranged themselves into a life that was unconventional and deeply satisfying, in a way that Genevieve had not expected life to be, and was very glad to discover it could. She stayed in Vienna through the spring. The Hague Tribunal concluded with a formal censure and a permanent removal from court, which was, in the structured language of vampire politics, a significant and historic outcome. The broader investigation that it opened into the court's handling of bloodline records and the enforcement of the blood law's human protections generated a reform process that the more progressive court members, who were less rare than common perception suggested, supported with genuine investment. Isidore met with the Valen bloodline's representative in April, a meeting that Genevieve sat in on at his request, because he wanted her there, and because she took very thorough notes. The Valen elder, a woman named Astrid, old and white-haired and winter-eyed, had looked at Genevieve across the table with an expression of careful appraisal, and then at Isidore with something much warmer, and had said, in the formal language of bloodline acknowledgement, that the house recognized him. Isidore had been very quiet. For a long moment, Genevieve had put her hand over his under the table. He had turned his palm up and held hers. They opened a small office in the 6th district of Vienna, a proper office with proper shelving and a consultation table, and 2 desks that faced each other, which was Genevieve's specific and non-negotiable arrangement requirement. The office worked with vampire families and human liaisons, navigating legal disputes, archival record challenges, and the complicated intersections of old-world blood law with modern legal frameworks. Petra joined them within 3 months. Thessaly served as security with a cheerful efficiency that suggested she found the work considerably more pleasant than the preceding 18 months of running. Vale came and went, which had always been his way, and always returned with useful intelligence about political developments in territories that needed watching. It was not a quiet life. It was a great deal of work, and it mattered, which was Genevieve's primary requirement for any work she agreed to do. She spent long hours reading documents that most people could not access and would not understand, and she wrote legal analyses that had real consequences for real families, and she argued precedent with court advisors who had centuries of practice and who consistently underestimated how thoroughly she had done her research. Isidore was magnificent in the formal meetings, which was not a surprise. He had spent 3 centuries in vampire politics. He understood power and its uses, and he brought to their joint advocacy work the same calm, dominant certainty that had made him impossible to simply dismiss, even when the court had been trying to. They argued sometimes. They had found this out around the 3rd month, that they argued with real intensity about legal strategy and about when to push the court and when to wait, because they were both people who had strong ideas about the correct approach, and neither of them was inclined to defer simply for the sake of peace. The arguments were always about real things, always resolved by the combination of Genevieve's forensic precision and Isidore's understanding of vampire political psychology, and they always ended with a better strategy than either of them had started with. Once, very memorably, an argument about the correct approach to a particularly complicated bloodline record challenge lasted 4 hours, moved from the office to a walk along the canal, circled back to the office, involved an extensive reference to a 12th century precedent that Genevieve pulled from memory in Isidore, verified against the actual document, and concluded with a joint legal brief that both of them agreed was the best work either of them had produced, at which point they were both too tired and satisfied to do anything, except sit together on the office floor with their backs against the shelves and laugh. He told her things about those 300 years, not all at once, not as though performing a history, but incrementally, the way trust actually works. Stories about courts he had moved through, things he had seen, the quality of the grief and the occasional joy of living as long as he had. She listened without trying to summarize it or solve it, which she thought was probably the right approach, and she told him things about her own history in return, which was considerably shorter, but no less genuinely hers. In June, he gave her a key to the house he had outside the city, which was not a castle. she noted, which surprised her. "I expected a castle," she said. "The castle is a cliché," he said. "You are a vampire prince." "Formally," he said. "And the house has good light in the mornings, which I understand you value considerably, and I can, with appropriate precautions, tolerate." She looked at the key. "You put in sun-protective glazing for me. The south-facing rooms have it." "Yes," she looked at him. "Isidore." It was a reasonable modification. She crossed the room and kissed him, which settled the matter. Late autumn in Vienna, the city golden and sharp with the smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke, and the office was busy with a new case that involved 3 bloodlines and a territorial archive dispute that had been building for 60 years, and Genevieve was at her desk with 3 documents spread in front of her and the precise, absorbed focus that meant she would not notice time passing for several hours. Isidore set a cup of coffee at her elbow. She looked up. He had his own work spread across his desk. Documents and legal notes, and the particular architectural chaos of an active case that somehow organized itself into perfect clarity when he presented it. He was watching her with those amber eyes that had first met hers across a very different room, and had not, in all the months since, lost the quality of looking at her, like she was the most interesting and important thing in his view. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You have ink on your hand." She looked at her hand. She did. "Archival hazard," she said. He smiled and went back to his documents. She looked at him for a moment, at the lamp-lit, familiar shape of him. This ancient, careful, formidable person who had climbed through her window one night with a secret older than most countries and had somehow become the center of her life through a combination of shared purpose and mutual stubbornness, and the very specific kind of love that grows between people who have genuinely seen each other in difficult circumstances and not been disappointed by what they found. She thought about the birth record she had found in the Prague vault, the story it had told of a woman who had made an impossible choice and hoped her son would be brave. She thought about all the pages that had been missing from his history for 300 years, finally returned to their correct place. She thought about the way a good archive told the truth eventually, if you knew where to look and were stubborn enough to keep looking. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Outside the window, Vienna continued its long, uninterrupted conversation with its own centuries. And inside the small office in the 6th district, 2 people who had found each other in the space between a hidden document and the truth it carried, went on building something that did not require any particular category to be entirely real. The record she would have filed if she had been archiving this story rather than living it would have noted the following: that Genevieve Winslow, human archivist, age 28, had entered a restricted vault in Prague in pursuit of a gap in the historical record, that the gap had led her to a document that was older than most living nations, that the document had led her to a man who had been waiting for it for 140 years, that the man had been, by every measurable criterion, exactly who the document revealed him to be, that what had grown between them was not a footnote or an aside, but the central narrative, the one that all the surrounding history had been, perhaps without knowing it, building toward. She would have filed it under truths that were worth finding. She would have filed it under things that the record corrected, eventually, when someone looked with the right eyes. She would have filed it, most accurately, under love. And the record, like all the best records, would have been complete.